Bonjour.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this second day in these Rencontres. DEX are so our general topic is about achieving transformations, and our topic this morning that has made you come in very large numbers indeed is about local governance. When we talk about territories in French, that can seem a bit dry, but we, of course, are thinking of the Yellow Vests movement, for example, and other crises, and that Yellow Vest movement could reappear. And when we look at the last four elections in 2022, the topics of governance and governing over divides and polarization, this is perhaps more topical than ever, and maybe we should work at a culture of compromise in France, and maybe looking at the private sector, because there are we have representatives from 3 different companies who will be able to bear testimony to how governance, how dialogue between the center and the periphery, tell us about local solutions, tell us about the solutions they've devised to crisis. So these are a few examples of what we're going to tackle with our guests. Chloé Morin, invited by the Cercle des Économistes. She's published a number of books, and she works for L'Express weekly magazine, and also works for the Jean Jaurès Foundation. So she'll probably tell us about this topic even more eloquently than I have. And then we are going to listen to Sabrina SOUSSAN, the new managing director of the new Suez. So we'll talk about water governance in this part of the country that suffers from drought. This will be really interesting. Thierry MALLET is the managing director of Transdev, so we'll talk about mobility and local solutions that still need to be devised. And Julien CARMONA, who's a banker, but he is actually, he represents Crédit Mutuel Arkea, so a fairly local network. So we should have an interesting debate. And we have someone by video link, Ms. AIYAR from the Center of Policy Research. Thank you, madam, for joining us, and we'll listen to you in a moment. So I'll give you 4 minutes. Chloé, your viewpoint, your stance on the topic. Okay, so this idea of a more local governance, when we talk about governance or institutions, experts have a sparkle in their eye, but private citizens usually repress a yawn. So when we conduct surveys, and this is pretty much what I do, looking at public opinion, people are not really fascinated by it. But if you look at recent events, it goes to show that it's really at the heart of our lives. Over the last few years, there's been an increasing criticism of institutions and of the decision-making process on a national scale, very presidential regime, an imbalance between the executive power and legislative power, and even the distribution of power between in the parliament. But this criticism remains the preserve of a circle of experts, even though more and more private citizens feel the limits of our model, and the crisis of the Yellow Vest movement is an illustration of that. But then came the legislative elections, so our general elections in France. And that conversation on how to better share power, how to better distribute power, really was the talk of the town. So what maybe politicians could not impose in the public conversation or in the debate in Parliament was imposed by private citizens. This is what makes these times in the period we're in so interesting. There'll probably be stumbling blocks and false starts, but we are in a time when there's a rethinking of roles and responsibilities, and the idea that power between executive and legislative powers needs to be redistributed, and between majority and opposition in Parliament. So there will probably be difficulties, there will be trial and error, but on a national scale, something will have to give. That's my conviction. That's my belief. So it is about a more efficient decision-making process to serve the national community, and that redefinition should also make it possible for us to act more efficiently. At least that's the hope. So there's no reason why this should stop. And it needs to be redefined on a local scale, which brings us to our topic this morning, because on a local scale, we can feel it, whether we be observers of political life, or whether we be private citizens at the head of local governments, or working for private companies. We need to improve the way decisions are made when it comes to transport, water management, or any sector of the economy or of politics. And stumbling blocks, hindrances, sources of inefficiency are too many. The challenge is quite clear. What's at stake is our capacity to face the different crises we have to weather. I'm thinking of not only the war in Ukraine, climate change, but also social inequalities, growing social inequalities. These challenges make it all the more pressing to rethink the way we make decisions and the way we think on a national scale, but also on a local scale. Which is why the topic of a better sharing of power is so fundamental, even though it might seem a bit technical. And I'm glad we're going to tackle it from a very concrete, hands-on perspective, listening to stakeholders that can really put a finger on how decision-making processes actually work, or how they should be improved. One of the central questions in political decision-making is what is the right scale for decision-making process so as to make for more effective action. Indeed. Thank you very much, Chloé. Yes, of course, can give Chloé a round of applause, and you can actually give us a collective round of applause at the end, maybe. Well, maybe to specify our topic this morning, we talked about politics, but there is but we do not have politicians here on this panel. We have practitioners, but these practitioners actually are in a constant dialogue with local decision makers, local elected representatives. Let's start with you, Ms. Sabrina SOUSSAN. You are the new CEO of Suez. In terms of scope, there hasn't been major changes, but in terms of being able to act on environmental matters and more specifically on water management, you constantly liaise with national and local decision makers. So how do you find ways to navigate that, bearing in mind that water, it's dawning on us that water is a resource that is going to become rarer, that's going to be in shortage. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here this morning. The new Suez company, maybe I can remind everybody that it's 40,000 employees and a leader in circular economy and green transition. Our two core businesses are water management and waste management. Since we are dealing with green transition and the environment, I'm going to insist on environmental governance. And I have 5 points I'd like to make. I'll start with the supranational governance, and I'll go all the way down to the local scale. With regards to my first point is that we are faced with a huge environmental challenge that we all have to rise up to. It requires a dual solidarity between generations, because the citizens today will make decisions that will have an impact beyond their lifetime. And secondly, advanced country economies will have to support emerging economies, even though their growth is going to be slower. That's a second challenge we'll have to rise up to. And supranational governance is necessary in the environmental sector. For example, think of UN climate conventions. Unfortunately, as far as water is concerned, we do not have that type of conventions. And that's a problem, because water is going to be a major challenge in the near future. There's going to be a conference in New York in 2023, a UN conference on water. There hasn't been such a conference since 1977. So I'll let you ponder that. So we really need an international body for that international governance on water. Second point I wanted to make is that international governance needs then to translate into national governance, which brings us back to our topic. We need to develop a more local governance with a legislative and regulatory framework that should be conducive to changes in behavior and quicker change. It's always better to illustrate with examples. So, general tax on polluting activities has made it possible to make it so that waste that should have gone straight to landfill were to be recycled. A second example, in Switzerland, there are regulations on micropollutants. There's an obligation to process, to recycle these micropollutants so that they're not discharged in the natural environment. Which brings me to my third point. Third point I wanted to make is that we need local solutions to meet local challenges. That's important as well. We need to look at local environmental challenges and how we can devise local solutions. An example that can be quite surprising: in the north of France, groundwater tables are being depleted, more and more depleted. It's a part of the country where there are lots of ammunition and pollution that date back to the two world wars, and that's a specific type of pollution that is very specific to that part of the country. So that requires local solutions. An example, as far as waste goes, when it comes to recycle, you have to really tackle it at the source point. And depending on the region, behaviors are completely different. So you have to adapt. In Brittany, for example, and in Alsace, they are really the best in France in terms of behavior. So, yeah, I mentioned Brittany completely at random. Okay, but it's true, all jokes aside. So you have to adapt to the specificities of local areas. And you have to make for more local governance, and you have to choose the right type of governance that is adapted to local context. When it comes to water management, there are delegation of public service, there are concessions. So it's the outsourcing of public service. We have mixed economy bodies. There are public-private partnerships. What else? Well, that's pretty much it. We support our customers so as to co-build, co-construct with them and find the best governance model that is really adapted to the local context. And public governance does not necessarily imply solutions to be implemented only by public stakeholders. It really has to be about a partnership. And my last point, the last point I wanted to make is about technology. So what we need to do requires more and more sophisticated and complex technologies, and these cannot be implemented in one local area. So complex solutions need to be developed at a more centralized level and a more centralized scale to meet challenges that are at play. Anaerobic digestion is to recycle sludge in water treatment on water treatment plants. This is highly technological. You can't implement that in local area. I'm thinking also of chemical substance recycling. So this needs to be more centralized because it requires really sophisticated technology. So to wrap up, I would say that green transitions and all the challenges we need to face require the right scale in terms of governance, be it so supranational, national or local. And it also requires stronger collaboration between private and public stakeholders. There can't be a one-size-fits-all solution. There's no silver bullet. There's no superhero. I'm not a superhero. But there can only be stakeholders that rally around these challenges. Thank you very much, Sabrina SOUSSAN. And you are on time, so I hope your male co-panelists will emulate you. So I just want to pick up on what you said. We'll take questions afterwards. You can send them by text, by the way, or ask them orally. We all wonder about drought because we are here in the part of the country that suffers from drought. Will we be able to fill up our pools in 10 or 15 years from now? Or will regulations allow for it? Or will it be a problem the same way as it is in California? Well, water, as I mentioned before, hasn't been at the top of the agenda. Yes, there's a lot of talk about CO2, but not so much about water. Recovery plan, 100 billion, 30 billion for the environment, very little, only 300,000 euros for water related questions. It says that France actually, there's a waste of water due to leakages in France that is the equivalent of the yearly consumption of Belgium. Yes, and you have to factor in the fact that it takes 200 years to completely renew networks. There's also a question of reusing, recycling of water. Of course, the largest amount of water is used for farming, and we often use drinking water for irrigation, rather than using recycled water, which is what happens in Italy or Spain. So 10% of water used for farming is recycled. In France, only 1% is recycled, so we're lagging behind. Okay, thank you very much. Second example, I mentioned the Yellow Vest movement because the question of mobility is really at the heart of local governance, local areas. With Thierry MALLET, you're the CEO of Transdev. How can we encourage local governments to cooperate on the right scale to devise solutions to encourage people not to use their car, but that requires efficient public transport. I'll give you the floor. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Well, to set the scene of daily mobility, because that's what we're going to talk about, let me share a few figures. Share of kilometers covered by car is 83%. Public transport only account for 11% of distance covered. And bikes, cycling accounts for 3%. Those are pre-COVID figures, but this goes to show how the overwhelming majority of traveling is done by car. So in France, people use cars way more than in Germany. It's linked to our urban development model. It's linked to the fact that 40% of the French population live in less dense areas that are not as well connected. Public transport has become very efficient in densely populated areas. You have trams, metros, buses. But once you're out of these densely populated areas, these metropolitan areas, there's not such an efficient service. The reason why French people use public transport is not price, is actually efficiency. Public transport is 7 times less expensive compared to using your car on average, which means that, and with petrol, of course, petrol price going up at the moment, at the weekend, where you don't have to necessarily be on time, more people use public transport. And despite this hike in price, there hasn't been a major development of public transport use, which means that we have to devise a better offer in terms of public transport. So 50% of miles covered are to actually go to work. And if you add daily travels to go to school or universities, that adds up to 60%. 34 kilometers are covered day in, day out to go to work. So that's definitely what's most important. Over 40% of people working in metropolitan areas do not live in that metropolitan area, which is the problem, because I said that services are organized for the metropolitan area, not taking into account all the surroundings of the metropolitan area. And I think we have to change scale, not think of metropolitan area as the only scale, but think of the sort of catchment area. So if we think of Bordeaux, Marseille, Paris, we have to look at the surrounding 50 kilometers. So we have to foster a new form of public conversation, of dialogue. And I'll come back to the example of Germany, in which Transdev is very present. In France, 11% of kilometers are covered using public transport. In Germany, it's 19% because there are more regional trains, regional buses, which make for a better alternative to cars. So you see, if you regulate even more in terms of, for example, low-emission areas, you'll make for more constraints, and that's not going to work. What's going to work is to develop an alternative to using your car. And it's actually once you're outside of the metropolitan area that the use of car goes through the roof. So we have to change scale. And we can talk about waste treatment. I think we have to look at that catchment area, which is really the right scale, no longer the metropolitan area. And this has to be a conversation between metropolitan area and regions. So what are the solutions you would put forward? Well, regional trains are a solution, regional light rail, but of course it takes a lot of time to implement that, to develop that. In the Bordeaux metropolitan area and the Aquitaine region, there's a line of coaches, of buses, 20 kilometers away from Bordeaux, between Créon and Bordeaux. It's a line that was actually commissioned just before COVID-19, and from day one, 1,000 people hopped on these coaches. And you had USB ports, Wi-Fi connection, you can sit. So they do not have dedicated lanes yet, but we're thinking of it. And from day one, people actually realized it was very popular because people realized that they could save on petrol. But for people to leave their cars behind, have there been parking space, new parking space? Yes, indeed, there are parking spaces so that people can park and then hop on the bus. Well, there's a big parking space near the Saint-Arnoux toll station, 50 kilometers away from Paris, so that they can actually take a bus that takes them to Massy, which is where you can actually take a train, and you have coaches, buses every 5 minutes. And you can save even more, 270 euros you can save every month. Well, bearing in mind the price of petrol, this looks like the perfect solution. How can we upscale that? Well, metropolitan areas and regions need to really get to grips with that, because these services, these bus lines, from between Créon and Bordeaux, it only took 6 months to commission that. Electric buses can be electric buses. We started with diesel. But actually, one diesel bus has less impact in terms of pollution than thousands of diesel-powered cars. Between Avignon and Aix, between Aix and Toulon. So electric buses can help cover sometimes 50 kilometers. Well, one last question. There's a lot of talk about making public transport free, because there's the question of cost of living that is, of course, very topical. Is that a good solution? Is it a bad solution to encourage people to leave their cars at home? Well, as I said, to encourage people to use public transport, price is not actually the main factor. People use public transport because it's more convenient. There are actually concessions and reduced prices for people who can't afford public transport. So really, what is the determining factor is to have a good public transport offering, to really multiply twofold that offer, so that we can move to 80% of people using their cars down to 60% of people using their cars. People will go on using their cars, but the point is to have them not cover 50 kilometers while using their car, but cover 10 kilometers till they can park their car and hop on a bus. And so these buses, you have buses every 5 minutes at peak hours, but of course you want to be able to rely on these buses and coaches, so they have to be reliable and frequent. And let me remind you that 25% of people in France had to decline a job offer because they knew they would not be able to commute to work. So being able to leave your car at home increases your freedom of moving around, so we have to devise more solutions. So the point is really developing public transport offer. It's not price that is the determining factor.
Well, thank you. As you say, we can talk about the topics in very practical terms. Without any political issues. So with Julien CARMONA, we are now going to talk about governance. Well, you are a regional bank, so there's the issue of financing close companies or local companies, which is really very topical. And there's a second topic, which is how can we discuss again with the Federation? You said that yesterday you were talking about, with the Federation of Crédit Mutuel, the position of Arkea, because you would like to take on more importance. So you're going to look at governance along those lines. I'll let you pick how you want to start. Well, thank you for inviting me. Well, first I'll start with the general terms and then go over to the specific. So territorializing is a term that is difficult to mouse. Let's replace it by another difficult word, which is subsidiarity. So what can be done well at one level shouldn't be taken care of by the higher level. Why not? Because it would be inefficient and unfair. It would be unfair to deprive a local human community of the means of treating a topic that they can do well. This comes from the social church doctrine, but it's also something that applies. So we are a territorial and regional bank, which has its headquarters in a small community next to Brest, in Relais-de-Quérion. So we're very well implanted in Rennes, in Brest and Bordeaux, because we're also part of the Girondine region, and we're also Girondin in the political term. And we have 11,000 people working for us, including 10,000 who are outside the region around Paris. So we might feel maybe we're the last of the Mohicans, or we are precursors. Well, you feel like the last Gaulois village, yes, but we have the biggest growth of all French banks, and including for employment, because we increased our headcount by 20% over the past few years, when other banks were decreasing their headcount by 7 years. So this may be due to the fact that we're a local bank, but that is innovating. So we're part of a situation which we all know, which is that of a country that is hugely centralized. Everything is centralized in terms of law, legal centralization. In terms of competencies, there's been decentralizing laws that, in fact, led to more complexity, because the state does not let go of its prerogatives, and there's even more levels now, and no level can act on its own. When we talk about economic development, we first turn to the regions, Bretagne, Nouvelle-Aquitaine, Pays de la Loire, and then to the metropolis when they have the competencies. But the regions may be political actors, but they are dwarfs at financial level. They haven't got the right levels, the right financial means, like the lenders or the Spanish regions, for example. So France is still hugely centralized, and as soon as something can change, we start with the principle of territoriality and central principles of the Republic. I remember Edith Cresson, who was unfairly criticized because she was the only one who delocated or deconcentrated about 20 public organizations, including ENA, the higher school of education. And it's a pity she was criticized for this. There's another example of the delocalization of Reef, which used to be in Issy-les-Moulineaux and is now in Brest, which is close to the sea, which seems perfectly logical. But it took 15 years before it was announced and it was implemented. And now everybody is happy because the researchers, as they are oceanographers, are happy to be close to the sea. But who opposed it? Well, the people who said we have to be in Paris because it's a good thing to be close to the Ministry of the Sea. Well, things changed with the COVID crisis, really. You have over 90% of big companies are located in Paris, except for Michelin in Clermont, Lactalis in Laval, or Yves Rocher in Morbihan. 17,000 people throughout the world, or we're in Brest, etc. So things are moving. The state, the structure is not moving, but there seems to be a movement that comes from the upwards, really. It comes from companies because you have the appearance of local champions or big national companies get organized and want to be re-territorialized. And you have great examples of companies or like us who think it's in the interest of their staff and citizens. And there's citizens who are starting to do that, to decentralize themselves. Because the idea is not to have a big metropolis in the middle of a desert. If the idea is to have Toulouse in the middle of the desert or Bordeaux in the middle of a desert, it wouldn't be the right thing. So issues are issues of mobility, and that might lead to a new territorial planning. I don't think things will come from the top because the state doesn't want to do it and may no longer have the ability to do so. You were part of a ministry a long time ago, yes. And you have to be clear about that. But planning coming from coming upwards would be very interesting. 3 words about our bank model. We're a mutualist and cooperative bank. What does it mean? It means that we have no shareholders. We are representative of the members of our society, and they elect elect authorities. Have been elected by 300 local offices. And all are the, you have professional people, you have farmers or people with different jobs. This is a model of governance which might have sent you smiling a few years ago, but which is extremely modern. Obviously, like for some mutual companies, there have been some drifting, but if you're very careful not to have this drifting, it's very important for you to be anchored in the territory and the stakeholders. And thanks to this, obviously, we defined a raison d'être. We became a society with a mission 2 months ago with objectives that we feel are very important. What many companies do, they say we adopt objectives and we commit to them and report about them. And so this is a way of contributing to the territorial vitality. This is what we try to do. We're on our way. We are not very popular with the technical structure of Paris, for example, to which I used to belong, it's true. And what about the story of Crédit Mutuel Arkea? It's a project of freedom, autonomy, and subsidiarity. We're legally part of a group which is Crédit Mutuel, which was highly decentralized originally, and this is why it's so strong. And it's not so decentralized now. Why? Because of consolidation. And now you no longer have one Crédit Mutuel, but 2. We have us, the small one, and the group which was born in Strasbourg. It's called now Crédit Mutuel Alliance Fédérale au CIC. But it's difficult to have a balanced governance. So there are two solutions. Either the one that was talked about in 2018. It can't continue working like that. We have to be independent. We go out there. So it would be great, but we know that all our authorities are not for it. But if it's the only solution, we'll opt for it. Or we have to find a system which is based on subsidiarity. As in Europe, you have a collective project. Some decisions were, and decisions are made unanimously. And if it works, it would be a great solution. So if I can. Well, thank you for this great presentation. So if I can summarize, you tried to get a divorce with consent, yes, or a body separation. Well, thank you for keeping to the time that was allotted to you. I tried to balance it. Now we have Mrs. Yamini AIYAR. She's not with us today, but can we be connected to India, please? Hello, madam. 7 minutes to explain.
And you have the place is yours.
Thank you. It's a privilege for me to be part of this discussion, and I'm deeply sorry that I'm not able to be there in person, both to learn from the exchange in person as well as to enjoy the beauty of the countryside of France. Hopefully, on another occasion, I'll have the chance to be there. I've been listening to this discussion with great interest, coming from it from the perspective of my home country, India, from where I speak today. And I thought it would be useful for me to talk a little bit about India's experience with territorialization or local governance, and why it matters for us as a country to privilege the importance of territorial governance or local governance as a lesson perhaps for other countries as they are thinking about precisely these challenges. And I'll make two remarks here. First and foremost, India, as many of you may know, is a deeply diverse country. Some have often said that India is many states, many ethnicities, many regions, many religions coming together to hold together in the form of a nation state. One characterization has been of India as a state nation rather than a nation state. And I think that our constitutional recognition of the importance of local government, or federalism is the word I would use, has been core to what has made this country, which is so deeply diverse and very different in some senses, hold together and stay together as a united nation. And the reason I say this is because in diversity, there are inevitably, democracy even inevitably creates the spaces and the demands for deeper representation and deeper presence within the democratic structure. Federalism allows for that kind of accommodation. It allows and enables ethnicities, religions, languages to find their representation within the broader makeup of the nation state. In India, for instance, in the late 1950s, we had a lot of representational anxiety around the linguistic question. How do different languages, which are linked to different cultures, different ethnicities, different regions, find themselves represented in the democratic project that India had embarked on in 1947 when we became independent? The ability of the federal principle to accommodate for these anxieties resulted in a redrawing of state boundaries, and I think is at the heart of what makes for the diversity of India stay together. had we not worked towards a federal architecture that recognized the importance of representational needs of this diversity, perhaps the ability to hold together in a democratic fashion may well have been far, far more constrained. There is, of course, an irony in this, which is also worth highlighting, that in the Indian context, the ability of the nation state to accommodate for these representational needs for deeper localization has required a much stronger national government compared to many other federal countries across the globe. In that the national government holds the power constitutionally to redraw boundaries of states, which is how we were able to respond to these claims of representational demand from different parts of the country. What it does do, though, and it's something for us to think about as we work towards the discourse on deeper localization and better representation, is that a strong center often gets vulnerable to deeper centralization, even in a federal context. And if you look at the current political challenges that India is confronting today, the strong powers allocated to the center are in fact resulting in a deeper centralization, which is the antithesis of what has made Indian democracy survive effectively. So I think the importance of localization, of local governments, of territorialization of governance rests in the ability of democracy to be able to respond to representational needs of people across different cultures, ethnicities, diversities, and it enables for a more fuller democracy and a fuller representation. The second quick point I wanted to make in my remaining time was building on what the previous speaker had said on the importance of the principle of subsidiarity. What must be done at a particular level of government, the local level of government, the middle level of government, the national level of government, should only be done by that level of government and no other. Again, India is a really important case study of how, despite a federal system, we get it often very wrong, and as a consequence, fail to provide high-quality public services at the level at which they are supposed to be provided. Often, it is the national government or the subnational government that is making decisions on functions like water, waste management that we spoke about earlier in this session, the delivery of education, the delivery of core public health services for local governments. And the reason that becomes problematic is because there is no one-size-fits-all in a large context. The needs of healthcare in the eastern part of the country are very different to the needs of healthcare in the northern part of the country or the southern part of the country in the following way. Our demographics look very different. So some parts of northern India are much younger in terms of their populations relative to some parts of southern India. But when the central government is designing health policies and health delivery systems, they can't accommodate for these differences. So southern India needs to deal with communicable diseases or non-communicable diseases like heart, cardiac issues, diabetes, and so on, whereas northern India is still dealing with communicable diseases. They require very different policies and very different approaches. COVID-19 highlighted how important that this is in India when we experienced this very, very difficult health challenge. It turned out that those parts of India that had stronger local governments, where health was being implemented provided through the local government, we in fact had a much better and much stronger response to the health challenges that COVID presented us than those parts of the country that didn't have so much robust subsidiarity in how they handle health policy. So COVID was a very good example of why subsidiarity should be at the heart of how we think about the challenge of local governance or territorialization of governance. A second area of urgency which has come up consistently in the course of this conversation today is the challenge of climate and the importance of local governments in responding to that challenge of climate. Water, environmental protection, waste management, all of these issues which are the pollution, all of these issues which are at the heart of responding to the challenge of climate require a very localized response both because it requires deep shifts in behavior, which can only be achieved through a closer interaction between local governance and the people, but also because these are genuinely local services which, on the basis of the principles of subsidiarity, are best delivered at the local level. But it throws up one last challenge for the question of local governance, which I think we need to debate in platforms like this, which is that as the needs of governance become more local and as we move towards a more localized governance structure, the needs for intergovernmental coordination and cooperation also become quite significant. In addressing the challenge of climate, there are different roles that government policy at the federal level have to play, that the subnational governments have to play, and that the local governments have to play. And each of these require deep coordination because a challenge like climate requires a whole. Therefore, we need to be thinking more harder about how the principle of subsidiarity translates into deeper intergovernmental coordination and what kind of institutions we need for that. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony and experience. Sorry, because we are late of time. Merci beaucoup, Yamini AIYAR, pour ce témoignage.
Thank you very much, Yamini AIYAR, for this testimony about the greatest democracy in the world. We see that the issue of subsidiarity is true everywhere. We have very little time to take questions from the audience, but I'll take the ones on the text messages. Do you think we should end the Paris centralization of power and decision-making? The efficacy of our institutions could be better highlighted with a reference for assessment of territoriality. What about the citizens' politics? This is the famous demand for bottom-up decisions that was mentioned. Maybe the famous Gaulois villages that always resist is sending us a message, all of us. Let me start with you, Sabrina SOUSSAN. How do you think that in a way this 2002 year, we know that things have to be different and we have to aim towards efficacy, which is mainly at local level? Well, I believe that there's more and more demand for involvement, as we can see. This demand comes from citizens and companies. The staff members want to be involved more and more. We talk more and more about raison d'être. In fact, you attract talents with a raison d'être more than with a salary. And this is why we need this involvement. Now, there's not one rule for all, one size fits all. We have to see that some solutions are better locally, others are better defined at central level. And what we have to do is work well together and cooperate at all levels. Thierry? Well, if we look at companies today, when we looked at what happened with the COVID crisis, the decision-making centers, they were central, they were local, and the center was really synthesizing what was taking place at local level. Transdev, we're present in many countries, and we carry 25 million people every year. And I would say that things are organized at city level. And in fact, with COVID, we increased our decentralization with the principle of subsidiarity. Decisions are made on the spot. I have no two maintenance warehouses that are managed in the same way. Now, everybody gets organized they want to be. If I invent a solution in Berlin, in Paris, or in Stockholm to organize the maintenance depots, usually in the field, people do the reverse to show that what comes from this the center doesn't work. So when you have a lot of confusion, you don't know who's responsible, and you can't improve. So I believe that the principle of subsidiarity, making sure we're working at the right scale. If you're too small, we saw it for cities, you have to have really the whole basin But you have to invent new examples. You have to see what's being done elsewhere, not necessarily in the country. You can look elsewhere also in other countries to find the right level of subsidiarities and of responsibility. When we know who is making the decision, if you accept to take it, you can't escape your responsibilities. Julien CARMONA, between 20 and 2020, what changed, and what do you think is more modern in what's happening now? Which may be the best thing? Well, thank you, Philippe. It may be difficult to decode the message we had in the elections. If we look at the number of voters, they are not that many. Well, maybe that's the main message. So that was the first thing. Secondly, if we look at the conclusions from the government, first of all, there's notion of planning, ecological and environmental planning. And I hear several things, something that is right and something that's not as good. First thing is that you have to plan properly, because for some investments, they only become profitable. The return only comes after 50 years, or it doesn't come. And the second thing is the right planning. For example, 5-year planning. You have very clever people who organize that and then send it to the field, saying, well, you make do with this. And the last thing is to have elected authorities like Christophe Béchu or others who are high-quality people and will carry the vision. But it's not all black and white. Obviously, the state has a role to play to design a nuclear program. For example, no one else but a strong state could do that. And there's something else that I didn't mention, which is not directly linked to the elections, but which seems important. We need territorial decision-making centers, but you also should have financial decision-making centers. You should have regional banks, regional stock exchange that have disappeared, but we could come again, and without being Manichaean. For example, you have big structures that have managed to delocalize and deconcentrate. But if you haven't got the financial level, you don't have much power. Thank you, Julien. Chloé, one word of conclusion. Did we answer the question, should we decentralize everything? In a few minutes. I don't know. But there's one thing we should, maybe we can mention briefly. It's a cultural topic. While staff members ask for more power, citizens want more power. We can see that in our relation with national institutions. We see that we're all very much attached to the notion of strong human beings. The fact that there's no absolute majority in the parliament is also seen as something to be feared, because we feel, okay, if only one person decides, we're going to be efficient and it will go fast. But if the decision is scattered, we'll be inefficient. And we're worried about the fact that parliaments will take time to pass laws, even though for many years we've passed laws by way of emergency that are never well applied. So it's a cultural paradox to the power, and which explains why we are not at the end of the road yet. Well, thank you for this conclusion and this hope, and we'll listen to Elisabeth Born at the beginning of the afternoon to see if the message, if everybody got the message. Well, thank you very much.